Hello everybody and welcome to ChessDiagnostic. So we are on the Taimanov versus Bobby Fischer match, candidates 1971. We're going to go through the 6 games where Bobby Fischer won every single game. Most of them were Sicilians and King's Indian defenses, and it's rather surprising actually that looking through the games, I just did a quick run through. I've analyzed these games before many years ago, but I was much weaker then, and now I can really get a grasp of what's going on in these games. In this specific game, the first game, Taimanov was actually had an advantage at one point, but he just miscalculated, and the game actually ends in a position where it's not clear why he resigned. We'll analyze some variations. Let's get into the game. So it starts with d4, knight to f6. Bobby Fischer's black, and he played the King's Indian whenever he could. So we get c4, g6, fianchettoing that bishop. After knight to c3, we see bishop to g7. e4, establishing that huge pawn center, and some basically center control and rather dynamic chances for black. After d6, we see knight to f3, castles, and after bishop to e2, preparing to castle himself, black plays e5. So I just want to make a quick analysis note that the reason black can play e5 in this variation, and I've had some students that might ask this, is if white takes the pawn and black takes, then we'll just trade queens, and even though that pawn looks like it can be taken, it actually can't because we get knight takes e4. A tactical shot, and actually it just trades down into a totally equal endgame, and black might actually have an advantage because he's more developed. So the point is, if knight takes here, then actually bishop takes on c3 check, and black has won a piece. So that doesn't work. He's forced to take on e4, and then we just take with the bishop. So trading down into an otherwise equal endgame. Both players have 2 bishops, and there's no pawn weaknesses at this point. So unless the white player wants to trade down, which normally he doesn't, playing the King's Indian here. So that's just top-level theory, just to clarify that. So after e5, we get castles, knight to c6, and then d5, establishing the King's Indian structure with a closed pawn center, and now white will try to play on the queen side, and black will play on the king side. Knight goes back to e7, bishop up to d2, developing the bishop, and then Bobby Fischer goes for the standard line of knight back, preparing f5. Rook to c1, potentially preparing a queenside expansion, attacking the base of the pawn chain on d6. And then we see f5, expanding on the king side and also giving more space to his pieces, which are mainly located on the king side. Takes with the pawn. Now he could take with a piece, but the pawn's normally better because you want to open this G file for a kingside attack, as well as use it to push and chase back white's pieces. So the knight moves forward, and this is standard theory. After h6, he puts his knight on e6, forcing the bishop to take, and then Bobby Fischer goes after that weak pawn now. Queen to c8. So we get queen to b3. Now if the queen just takes right away, he'll just take on b7. So Bobby Fischer plays c6, preparing something like if c4, for example, we get d5, cutting off the protection of that e6 pawn. And the other point is that after queen takes b7 and the rook comes in, the pawn actually is protected by the knight on c6. So bishop moves up to h5 to attack that knight, but actually Bobby Fischer just takes it, and now even though the bishop could take, and queen could take on b7, Fischer's still going to win a pawn with some interest. And by interest, I mean he's going to win a pawn with a more active rook, more active position. Alright, so we get the following tactical sequence. After queen takes b7, the knight moves to f6, attacking the bishop. Bishop goes back, and then we see rook from f to b8. Queen goes back, and now, even though it looks like black is more active, the computer is actually evaluating as equal, but I'm sure Bobby Fischer thought his position was quite good at this point. And the reason is of course black is more active. attacking some of white's pieces with his active rook, but of course black has some weaknesses himself, and a rather loose pawn structure can be a somewhat exposed king. We see how white consolidates after a few moves. So rook from f to d1, preparing to play on the d file, and Bobby Fischer chooses to play e4. A somewhat weakening move now that the f4 and d4 squares are weakened, but it allows him to open the dark squares for his bishop, as well as provide some support for his knights and play d5. Queen goes back to threaten the rook, rook goes back to b7, and then we see bishop to f4, immediately occupying that dark square on f4. d5, because the d6 pawn was attacked. And after a pawn trade, we see knight to b5, threatening a fork. And actually, Bobby Fischer plays knight to g6, threatening the f4 bishop. So it looks like white could have forked, and he could have, but Fischer's evaluation was that after queen to f7, knight takes. Now this knight's inactive, and we'll have some trouble getting out. But actually after knight takes to f4, and a few moves, for example, this is actually the strongest line, bishop to a6, rook to d7, and if the rook goes back, then the knight does get out. But after knight to g4, h3, and then knight to e5, actually this knight is going to be a monster, most likely stronger than any rook, and there will be a lot of threats on the king side. So Taimanov actually doesn't go for that fork. Going back here, after knight to g6, we see knight to d4, threatening the queen and occupying that weak square. So Taimanov has placed his pieces on very advantageous squares. Queen to d7, moving the queen back because it was attacked. And then queen to e3, threatening that h6 pawn. So the king moves up to h7, protecting it, and actually h3, giving some space for his king, but actually a slight inaccuracy. And if you want to try to guess the move that white could have made at this point, what do you think he could do? He could definitely play h3, but it's slow. In such a sharp position, white does have a slight advantage. His pieces are more active, and black's position is actually a little loose. So the move is, instead of h3, we see bishop to a6. Now the reason bishop to a6 is a better move than h3, other than it's more active, attacking, and it doesn't allow black to get into the game as easily, is that he really can increase the activity of his rook on c7, as well as win material if possible. So let's see a couple lines. So after bishop to a6, if, for example, the rook comes to b6, threatening the bishop, and instead of rook to c7, we could see something like bishop to b5. And now, if the queen moves, or even if the rook takes, for example, the knight doesn't take right away, we get rook to c7. If the queen goes back to e8, trying to hang on to that rook, then we see bishop to h5. Basically, because the bishop's pinned, he's going to win a ton of material. So that line doesn't work for black. And also, after bishop to a6, the rook really has no good squares. So if we see just knight takes f4, or here, let's go to another line. So instead of h3, bishop to a6, and then we see knight to g4. The queen could move, and then knight takes f4. Now the point is, if bishop takes, and we see, instead of something like rook to f8 trying to protect the rook, if he tries to get complicated with bishop takes d4, basically undermining that e2 square, if the rook takes, then we get knight fork of the king and queen. So we're not going to allow that. We see queen takes, and then after bishop takes, king back, bishop back, either the bishop could take, or he'll just threaten the queen. The bishop back is protecting that c7 square, and white's up material, and he's going to most likely win because black is just too exposed. So white really had his last chance to win this game instead of h3 with bishop to a6, and at this point, after rook to f8, I just want to make a point of this specific position. So I really make a point to study these kinds of positions where there's dynamic chances for both players. After h3 instead of bishop to a6, black really has to find a plan of what to do. The f5 pawn is attacked. There's really no good square for the rook, which is the least active piece he should develop. All of black's pieces are active except for this rook on a8, and he can't bring it to c8 because after the rook trades, then we'd see a pin. And there's really no good square other than rook to f8. So Bobby Fischer just develops his least active piece, and also preparing something like f4 if the bishop dislodges itself, and if the knight moves, then the f5 pawn's protected. So after rook to f8, we see bishop to a6, but now it's too late because we see rook to b6. The rook can come in on c7, but actually after queen to a4, hitting the bishop as well as this undefended rook, the bishop can take on h6, but the queen would take with check and white would be losing. So actually after rook takes, and then we see this fork here, the king moves, and now unfortunately the bishop can't take the rook because queen takes rook check. So the bishop on a6 has to move back, and now Bobby Fischer actually has a slight advantage. He's not totally winning at this point, but his advantage lies in a human component. Technically, the computer might evaluate this as equal, but he's actually up material with his pieces, even though he's down some pawns. He's going to win some pawns in the endgame, and that's his immediate strategy, is to trade down into an endgame. So after white wins a pawn with knight takes f5, we see rook to b1, trading the rooks. And then after the king goes up, the queen comes back, threatening that knight. And then after queen to d6 check and g3, Bobby Fischer plays queen to b4, threatening to play queen to e1 and going for a checkmate attack. Instead, we see knight comes back, and we don't want to play this move because actually after queen takes a7 check, then it's actually black who might have some trouble. Instead, we see an immediate trading to the endgame with queen to b6, and the knight wins the pawn with an x-ray attack. Queen takes. Now notice that the queen can't take because the queen's still protecting that knight. So queen takes, and then bishop takes. After rook to e1, Taimanov resigned, a rather sudden resignation. When I first saw this game, I had no clue what was going on, but now I can see it very clearly. So after rook to e1, the point is this light square bishop has no good squares along the h5 to d1 diagonal. And if he moves off, then after knight to e5, black might actually have a mating attack. So the only move, and the sealed move, was actually bishop to g4. The whole point is, well, the knight could just take, but actually after knight to e5, the bishop can't move. He's going to win a pawn, and he's going to win even more material after knight takes bishop. If he tries to hang on to this bishop, knight takes bishop, rook takes, and it's just totally resigning because the rook will win all the pawns except for this g pawn, and the knight is just too weak over here in the corner. So this is just an example line. If he plays bishop to d4, we see rook to e2, winning that pawn. Or if he tries to hang on to that pawn, we see another line where he's going to play e3. And now actually he'll chase that king back and then just play e2, and that pawn is queening. So that's the reason Taimanov resigned, and there's no good moves after rook to e1 for white. So it was a rather sudden loss because it looked like it was an otherwise equal game, and Taimanov could have actually possibly won. So this is the beginning of the match that ruined Taimanov's life. So I hope you enjoyed this game, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye. Hey everybody, thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed this video. Hit the like button, leave a comment, and subscribe for future videos. See you in the future.